Hi everyone, my name is Trinity Casey, and thank you so much for watching my oral presentation on my thesis, When a Woman Takes Power. So jumping right on in, these are kind of the main points that I focused on in my research, and they will be further explored more as we go throughout this presentation. These are also some of the images and artists that I researched and kind of cultivated this thesis around. I cannot go over every single one, so I will just be focusing on examining one later on in the presentation. So this is my thesis statement, and it really boils down to examining a long-standing tradition of women having agency taken from them by having their bodies used as objects for viewing pleasure, and the efforts of future women artists to confront these mindsets created by the male gaze and demand space for their voices and stories. So what is the male gaze? Very quickly, it was a term introduced by Laura Mulvey, who was a film critic. It was in her essay in 1988, where she described it as the active domination of the male viewer over the passive female figure to subject the male fantasies upon, perpetuating sexual inequalities by transforming the female body into an object for display and viewing pleasure. Future scholars who came after her even agreed that it was definitely a matter of control over a passive female figure. And the implications of this is that that female figure was an idealized version of the woman and could not accurately represent their experiences or histories due to a lack of autonomy over how they were represented. And it is important to note about the male gaze that despite it saying it is the male gaze, anyone of any gender can fall under and perpetuate the male gaze because it was introduced by a dominant male authority and perpetuated, and it is a mindset that permeates throughout society. So anyone can do this. So one of the artists that I'll be focusing on today is Renee Cox, and just a bit of background on her. She was originally born in Colgate, Jamaica in 1960. When she was young, her family moved to Scarsdale, New York, and she went on to get a bachelor's in film study and an MFA from Syracuse University, I believe. Her artwork, she said one of her goals in creating her art was to create new representations for Black women, and that she used her figure as an expression and appreciation for Black womanhood. So a lot of her work is photography, and in her work, she inserts Black figures into religion and history. And just a bit of historical context that you'll need to know about the piece that we'll be examining is Saartjie Baartman, who also known as Sarah Baartman or the Hottentot Venus. She was a South African woman from the Khoi Khoi tribe, and she was taken to Europe to become pretty much a spectacle. She was viewed and exhibited for 5 years, became a symbol for excessive sexuality due to her larger posterior and her labia minora. And she represents how historically there have been major limitations on representation for Black women. And when there were representations, they were often viewed in sexualized manners, such as she was, and labeled as exotic or other. So part of what Renee Cox does in this photograph labeled Hottentot is confront the viewer with a number of things. So one of them, immediately you'll notice she's wearing prosthetics. So one of the things is the hypocrisy of sexualizing a Black woman and labeling her as an exotic commodity when the use of prosthetics to emphasize curves that will label a Black woman as sexual and other was an active practice of high society. So even just the use of her prosthetics can have multiple meanings. That's what I love about art, is that you can definitely read into it a bit more. So it could be her way of putting on the persona of Baartman by emulating her own proportions, or it can also be, an examination of how Baartman didn't have control over what she looked like, whereas you can put on and take off these prosthetics, and Baartman had to live with the body she had and the consequences of having that body based on how other people viewed her. So I just wanted to give an example of kind of the padding and silhouettes that were trying to be emulated at this time. You often had the bum roll, which was a padding that accentuated a thin waist and then a rounder posterior. In the middle, you see that result. and then that silhouette further developed into crinolines, which were kind of like cages that provided that same structure of a larger posterior. So looking at an image of Saartjie Baartman, you can see that she did have that very much rounded posterior in the back that padding and stuff tried to emulate. But what was interesting is that instead of her curves being celebrated, they were made a spectacle of sexual otherness due to her race, and as she was exposed to voyeurs, scientists, anyone who had the access to her. So as you can see in Renee Cox's prosthetics, they kind of gap around her body, and you can see an emphasis on the unnatural shine of those prosthetics that emphasize that these are not her natural curves. So she's kind of making a statement of how while Saartjie was a specimen who was objectified, she's donning these artificial prosthetics to acquire similar curves on a female body, but by making that direct eye contact, she's challenging. And I'll go into that further. She's challenging any gazes with her own. So she's challenging anybody who's looking at her being like, oh, those are, nice curves. She's being like, something, she's essentially having power over this image. That's something that Saartjie couldn't have over herself. And it's an expression of her own agency. So going back to the image, I do want to talk about her use of eye contact. It's very reminiscent of, what we consider some classic art like Olympia by Manet. It challenges anybody who's kind of looking at this image and objectifying the body of Saartjie Baartman, but they don't recognize their own part in perpetuating racial disparities and stereotypes. And it even has a modern interpretation of sexualization of Black female bodies without allowing them the space to embrace that sexuality, because if they were to do so, they would be labeled as promiscuous or perverted. So anytime you kind of have eye contact with the viewer, you are challenging the way they're looking at you. You're confronting them with the reality of what their gaze is doing. So, sorry, didn't mean to go farther. I also wanted to focus on how this was a reclamation. It's her using her own body to push the narrative of not only reflecting her own struggles due to her gender and race, but outdated stereotypes and traditions that were put in place due to the objectification of Black women, and how these are still prevalent today. So from Saartjie back in what was probably the early 1800s, we are still experiencing this objectification and sexualization of, female bodies of color. So her using her own body becomes a reclamation of her own sexuality as well, reclaiming her body with stories of Baartman who were labeled as other and thus denied their own autonomy. She's very much taking control of how she's viewed and how she allows others to view her. And it's a very strong image for sure. And it's just one of the pieces I decided to focus on in my work. And I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to listen, as I know this is a huge day for so many people and for me as well, and allowing me to be a voice and, show you things like this that you maybe wouldn't have known about or known the history or the implications behind. So thank you so much.